Hello all, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3, and in this particular video I want to talk to you about what is a research pipeline or an academic pipeline. So if you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There's so many people that help me out that I want to pay the favor for it and help you out. So I created this sharing economy editing platform. That's what reciprocity.com is. You can check that out. Please do purchase some credits, upload a couple of documents, and I also created all these different resources. Okay, so what is a research pipeline? All right, so sometimes you hear about these particular terms, right, in terms of research pipelines and things like that, academic pipelines, and some of you might not know what it is. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't really kind of get that until I was well into the PhD program. But really what it is describing your research pipeline, is describing all the different ideas that you're currently working on, and tells other people what the state of the work, what you're actually working on with those individual ideas and those individual papers, right? So, it's basically, you can think of each paper that you're working on as one single different idea, and it's a really simple idea. But then there's many different nuances to that idea, and that's really what you're trying to explore with those individual papers. And then, there might be different kind of research paths that you can take with those individuals' ideas, and you're kind of describing those different paths that you take and sort of the wandering that you take over time with your research pipeline, right? So, when you sort of describe this, you can imagine that the sort of components of a research pipeline is, you can imagine kind of an Excel spreadsheet or a spreadsheet, right? So you have the rows, right? The rows are the papers that you're currently working on, right? All the different papers that you're working on, and all the ones that you've worked on in the past, all the different ideas that you worked on in the past. And then up here on the columns, you can imagine them as, the different sort of stages that you're working on, whether it's data collection, whether you are doing an analysis or writing it up, writing conclusions, all those different things. So you can imagine your research pipeline is sort of telling the story of how the papers are evolving down here, right? So you have, at the beginning, you might have kind of an abstract idea that's not necessarily all that good, and then you continuously evolve and develop different ideas. And maybe at one point, your research pipeline becomes really clear, and you can kind of investigate what it is. And then from there, you kind of go in different directions and sort of explaining what this particular, maybe it's one idea or two ideas. Usually it's not too many ideas that you focus on for a very, very long time. Most of us only work on a couple of basic ideas, and we have different papers and stuff like that. But the general sort of gist of things that we're working on. So, for example, maybe it is, maybe it is looking at how managers actually manage. Well, looking at that, that's a big question, right? How do they actually manage? So it might take you 30 years to investigate sort of all the ways that they actually manage, right? So we have all these ideas how we think they actually manage. And most of them are probably not all that correct until when you start digging in and finding out that, well, they don't manage that way, right? So I'm blanking on the guys. He's from McGill right now, a really famous researcher, Mintzberg, Henry Mintzberg. That's kind of what he did. It's just looked at, a portion of what he was doing is looking at, like, well, how do they actually, it was Mintzberg that did that. How do they actually manage? And what do they actually do on a day-to-day basis? Well, that's tricky. So you might actually have to, track them over time, right? And actually, get them to fill out diaries and things like that. And most managers are not going to do that. But anyways, so that's what your research pipeline is supposed to show, is how things evolve over time, right? And describe the story about what you're trying to do and what you're really interested in, and all the different nuances over time, and all the papers that you're working on. Now, can you actually speed up your research pipeline? So here's the caveat, right? So when you try to speed things up, and I study innovation, so, I've looked at some of this literature. Maybe I would love to do a little bit more, but, in general, I'm confident in this kind of stuff. But there's always unintended consequences when you try to speed things up, particularly within innovation efforts, right? So speeding things up you might sort of accomplish that, but then what's going to be the secondary concern, or what's the things that are going to happen from that? Maybe you speed things up, but then you get more demands on the system, right? So people realize that, oh, wow, you can do things a lot more faster. They start putting more demands on the system. And you can still end up not necessarily being better off by speeding up your innovation efforts, right? And speeding things up, right? So it's really difficult to sort of investigate this kind of stuff. So here's some basic ideas from the innovation literature in terms of speeding up, the how quickly you can get work done. So one of them is parallel development. That's where you work on multiple projects at once, and you give responsibility to other people to develop components of a paper that you're currently not working on, right? So it's kind of like the co-author thing. So you work on the theory section, somebody else works on the method section, and back and forth, you go back and forth. It doesn't work that clear though, or it's not that easy, right? There's always coordination costs when you are involved in that. And the other thing that you forget about is that there's switching costs that happen between projects, right? So you are working on a project, and if you're switching, every couple of weeks between projects, you have to get up to speed in what you're doing, and it takes you. It takes me a good day to sort of figure out, okay, what was it I was trying to do again? And you always forget about that kind of stuff, right? And so you just worry or think about the switching costs, and as well as the coordination costs that you have. So coordinating amongst all the other people that are involved in the project can be really difficult sometimes, right? So coordination costs could be just picking a date to meet. That can sometimes be really challenging with a bunch of really busy people. Another thing that you can do is just work more, right? So this is the thing that I think most people think about in terms of speeding up the innovation is, we just simply work more. That would be working longer days and weekends. And what you're actually doing is just condensing a bunch of your work that would have taken a lot longer over the time period, right? So over a longer time period, and condensing it into a shorter time period. The problem is you kind of run out of resources after a while, right? So the time that you have available gets shorter and shorter. And yeah, you can condense your sleep, right? So you only get 4 hours of sleep every night. There are people that do that kind of stuff, and that's wonderful for them. This is something that I personally don't choose to do, but you can definitely condense how much you're working, and you work more and more in those particular time periods. And you work, you just do less in other different areas, and that's reasonable. Is that something that is sustainable for a long run? Well, it depends on the individual person in terms of where you see yourself going. You might do a sprint for 10 years or 15 years, and then you kind of just give up on that thing. Or maybe you can keep that up for a long time. It's just really dependent on you in terms of how much you can sort of compress. But here's the thing: there's a limit for all of us in terms of how much work we can do and how much time we have. There's only 24 hours in a day, right? So it's limiting, and you have to think about yourself as like a major CEO, right? From a major company. There's 50,000 people that are working for them. They are not going to talk to those 50,000 people on a regular basis. You have to think about how they might manage that process, and think about different boundaries, for example, and sort of delegating responsibilities, and sort of moving things away off of your plate so you don't necessarily have to do a lot of that stuff. And that, they simply, they work a lot, but they're not going to be working 24 hours a day. Right. So you have to be cognizant of that and sort of think of your time in that sort of way. Now, a third thing is working with collaborators. And it's really, you do gain a lot with working with collaborators, because they know, often senior people, for example, know a lot of different tips and tricks that are really difficult. So it's tacit knowledge. It's called tacit. You can't really explain what it is. It's difficult to sort of tell other people what those tips and tricks are. And they have a lot of know-how because they've done that kind of stuff. So you can transfer some of that knowledge from them and gain a lot from what they are doing. A fourth thing that you can do is focus and become narrow in your research. So you just narrow down. And the reason is doing broad projects and doing projects in all sorts of different areas. It's stinking hard. because you have to learn all about those different areas, right? So the more that you learn of those different areas, yes, it expands your knowledge and you do more exploratory stuff, right? And you might be more cutting edge in the long run. It is hard to do it, though. Most people have a tough time. That's why we don't see people doing PhDs in mathematics and PhDs in psychiatry at the same time, right? So some people do that. They're extraordinarily talented, but most people are not going to do that, right? Because it's just really hard to do. And so you have to think about, okay, how can I narrow down and focus? We know from many, many years, hundreds of years at this moment, that of research and sort of ideas, that specialization is actually a really important tool to speed up productivity. So the more you can specialize, the more that you can focus on a little itty bitty topic, that better off you're going to be in the long run in terms of your productivity. That's all I'm going to say with productivity. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be happier, right? Because you can be really alienated from the things that you're working on, right? It just seems like it's kind of mundane, and you're not kind of going into different areas. So you have to think about that trade-off as well. Now, the fifth thing I think is thinking about in terms of whether you're working on more incremental versus radical research or radical ideas, right? So what does that mean? It is thinking about how different it is from the corpus of ideas that are currently available, right? So incremental ones are going to be closer to what people have already done, and you can build on what other people have done. Doing stuff on patent data, doing stuff on Fortune 500 companies using the CRISP and CompuStat data. That stuff's really easy, generally easier. I'm not saying it's easy. It's easier than going out and gathering data from North Africa, for example, and getting a large data set from North Africa. That is going to be much more trickier to get that data, or getting data from someplace like I don't know, Venezuela, for example. That is not part of what most research has been done in the past, right? Because there's many different problems. The biggest thing is telling other people why this is unique and different. That's going to be your hardest thing, right? So you're going to be able to see that, but to tell other people why that stuff is unique and different is going to take you a lot more time than what other people have done, because everybody's used in their mind about, everybody knows GE, right? We know that those kind of companies, they're really, they're stuck in our brains. And so you don't have to do a lot of descriptive work and sort of leg work there, but you're going to have to do a lot more if you start doing things that are more radical in different domains that people haven't seen before. Although that they're more attractive and they're more interesting for a number of different reasons, but it just takes a lot more leg work than those more incremental things. So focusing on the sort of narrower stuff really does help in terms of your specialization, or in terms of getting becoming more specialized, and then as well as doing research that you can do much more quicker by doing things that's a little bit more incremental. And we all do that. We sort of all think about, well, I should do a little bit more different project, a little bit more same project over here. And by doing that, you have a kind of a portfolio of things that are a little easier, a little harder to work on. And all projects are hard once you're doing it, and once you get into it, you realize that they're all difficult to do, and they're all difficult to explain. So, but anyways, that's all I want to talk about in terms of your research pipeline. Hopefully that answers your question: what is a research pipeline? And then I gave you some ideas in order to speed up your research pipeline. That's hopefully going to help you out in terms of what can you actually possibly do with a research pipeline. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.